They didn't just terminate me, they made me a spectacle, labeling me a bottleneck in glowing red before over 100 colleagues. What no one knew was that I alone understood why the company was hemorrhaging cash. When the founder walked in, the room assumed I was saved. The reality was much darker. I was being set up as the scapegoat for a dirty scheme worth tens of millions of dollars, destined to lose everything. My name is Melody Walker. I spent 12 years building the backbone of Brightridge Returns. 12 years of untangling the messy human errors of reverse logistics that no algorithm could quite figure out, building a department from the ground up to protect our profit margins. So, when the calendar invite for a mandatory all-hands town hall popped up for 9 in the morning on a rainy Tuesday, I felt nothing more than a dull, heavy annoyance. The agenda promised a strategic overview of our new artificial intelligence integration and a routine organizational restructuring. I assumed it was just another hour lost to corporate jargon, another slide deck designed to make executives feel innovative. I sat in the middle of the auditorium, surrounded by over 100 colleagues. The air conditioning was turned up too high, carrying the faint, sterile smell of dry erase markers and filtered, recirculated air. Up on the stage stood Weston Pike. Weston was our brand new chief operating officer, a man who looked like he had been engineered in a venture capital boardroom. He wore a tailored navy suit that easily cost $4,000 and a practiced smile that never quite reached his cold, slate-gray eyes. "We are entering a new era of efficiency," Weston declared into his sleek headset microphone, pacing the stage with predatory grace. Brightridge cannot afford to carry dead weight into the next fiscal year. Our margin of error must be zero. Our processing time must be instantaneous. I nodded along politely, nursing a lukewarm cup of coffee. I agreed with efficiency. I had spent thousands of hours building the very protocols he was currently standing on. I thought I was part of the foundation. I did not realize I was the rubble they planned to clear. Then, Weston clicked his presentation remote. The massive screen behind him shifted. The sleek blue corporate background faded, replaced by a stark white slide bearing a bold black title, Operational Friction Points. Below that heading, there was a flowchart, but it was not a chart of software integrations or server loads. It was an organizational map, and right in the dead center, encased in a thick, glowing red box, was a name: Melody Walker. My breath caught sharply in my throat. I blinked, sure that the high-definition glare of the projector was playing tricks on my eyes. But the red box remained, glaring down at me like a sniper's laser painted directly on my forehead. It was not a mistake, it was a design choice. To achieve our Phase 1 automation goals, we must identify and eliminate the bottleneck. Weston said. His voice was smooth, engineered to sound highly reasonable while delivering a public execution. For too long, we have relied on legacy mindsets. We have allowed manual processes to dictate our speed. We have let human inertia choke our potential. We cannot allow sentimentality to hold back our modernization. He was looking right at me. The entire room shifted. It was a subtle, collective movement. Over 100 heads turned, just a fraction of an inch, trying to catch a glimpse of my face without making direct eye contact. This was not a layoff. This was a slaughter. The cruelty of modern corporate America does not reside in shouting matches or thrown objects. It lives in the absolute, suffocating silence of a brightly lit room. Nobody gasped. Nobody stood up to object. Nobody called out the sheer, unprofessional barbarism of putting a loyal employee's name in red ink on a 50-foot screen. Instead, I saw the true face of my colleagues. 2 rows ahead of me, Sarah from accounting gave a tiny, involuntary smirk, masking it quickly by pressing her hand over her mouth. To my left, Mark, the regional manager I had helped out of a massive compliance nightmare just 3 weeks ago, suddenly found his smartphone incredibly fascinating, his thumb scrolling endlessly over a blank screen. The air grew thick with a toxic mixture of relief and schadenfreude. They were safe. I was the sacrifice. The soft chuckles from the back row sounded like dry leaves scraping across concrete. Every averted gaze, every forced, neutral expression was a microscopic knife slipping between my ribs. I was being stripped naked and beaten in front of people I had shared lunches with, people whose birthdays I had celebrated, people I had protected from the very executives now standing on the stage. My heart hammered a frantic, sickening rhythm against my sternum, yet my face remained frozen in a mask of rigid composure. I refused to let Weston see me crumble. I forced my eyes to scan the front row, looking for a single anchor in the shifting, hostile room. I found Eli Mercer. Eli was 23 years old, fresh out of a top-tier business school, a bright-eyed data analyst I had taken under my wing. For 18 months, I had taught him everything I knew about the intricate financial dances of vendor chargebacks and reserve accounts. I had advocated for his promotion just last quarter, fighting human resources to get him a better salary band. Eli was sitting rigidly in the second seat from the center aisle. He was not looking at the stage. He was staring intensely down at his lap. Resting on his knees was a crisp, freshly printed document. My vision tunneled, zooming in on the bold text at the top of the page. It was a role description. Director of Automated Processing, the role that was meant to replace mine. He knew. He had known before I even walked into the room. He sat there, clutching his new title and his 30% pay bump, while the woman who built his career was publicly dismantled. He did not look back at me. His cowardice was absolute. Therefore, Weston continued, his voice dropping an octave to convey a false, theatrical sense of gravitas. Effective immediately, the position of Director of Returns Processing is dissolved. The current workflows under the old regime will be absorbed into the new machine learning framework by the end of the day. There it was. The guillotine fell. I was suddenly unmoored, a ghost haunting a chair I no longer owned. I was expected to stand up, gather my broken dignity, and walk out past 100 pairs of judging, silent eyes. I was expected to disappear quietly, just another friction point successfully erased by the brilliant new management team. I gripped the armrests of my chair, my knuckles turning white, preparing to force my legs to stand. Then, a sound shattered the heavy, manufactured atmosphere of the auditorium. The massive oak double doors at the back of the room swung open with a heavy, reverberating thud that echoed off the acoustic panels. The sheer force of the entrance made heads snap around. Even Weston halted his pacing. His perfectly scripted presentation derailed. Standing in the doorway was Nora Holloway. Nora was the founder of Bright Ridge Returns. She was the architect of the original company, a brilliant, notoriously ruthless woman who had not been seen in the office for nearly 8 months due to undisclosed, severe health issues. The corporate gossip mill insisted she was fading, yielding total control to the board of directors and the aggressive new executives like Weston Pike. She did not look faded. She looked like a winter storm walking indoors. Nora wore a heavy black trench coat, completely soaked from the morning downpour. Rainwater dripped from the hem onto the polished hardwood floor, forming dark, jagged pools around her black leather boots. Her silver hair, usually pinned up in an immaculate twist, clung damply to her pale cheeks. She did not bother to take off her coat, brush away the water, or offer a polite corporate greeting to the room. She simply walked down the center aisle. The silence that followed her was entirely different from the silence that had suffocated me moments ago. The previous silence was built on complicity and cowardice. This silence was built on absolute, primal terror. People physically shrank back in their seats as she passed by, as if terrified her wet coat might brush against them and freeze them solid. Weston cleared his throat, a pathetic, wet sound in the painfully quiet room. "Nora, we were not expecting you to join this alignment session today. I am just outlining the new efficiency metrics for quarter 3 and implementing the board's mandate for structural agility." Nora did not look at him. She did not look at the glowing red box with my name inside it on the massive screen. She walked with slow, deliberate steps until she reached the very front row. She stopped right next to a visibly trembling Eli Mercer, and only then did she raise her sharp, dark eyes to the stage. When she spoke, her voice was not loud. It did not need to be. It cut through the over-air-conditioned room like a surgical scalpel. Cold, precise, and lethal. She did not offer me a warm smile. She did not defend my years of loyal service or my dedication to the company culture. She bypassed emotion entirely, striking directly at the throat of the men on the stage. "Who gave you permission?" Nora asked, every single word dripping with glacial, uncompromising authority. "To eliminate the only person in this building who understands the entire system you are trying to sell." The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Weston's professional, practiced smile shattered instantly, leaving behind a slack, pale imitation of executive confidence. The words hung in the air, heavy, toxic, and dangerous. Nora had not just stopped my public execution. She had ripped the heavy velvet curtain down, exposing a word no one below the executive suite was supposed to hear: sell. I sat perfectly still, my pulse roaring like a freight train in my ears. The crushing humiliation evaporated, replaced instantly by a cold, sharp, terrifying clarity. I was not just a bottleneck. I was not just a victim of corporate restructuring. I was a massive, inconvenient loose end in a high-stakes game I did not even know was being played. And looking at Nora Holloway's steely, rain-soaked posture, I realized the war had not just ended with my firing. It was only just beginning. The auditorium emptied as if someone had triggered a silent, invisible fire alarm. People did not run, but their hurried, synchronized shuffle toward the exit spoke volumes. The crowd parted around me, leaving a physical radius of empty space as if my sudden fall from grace was an airborne contagion. I was a walking crime scene, and nobody wanted their fingerprints found on the victim. I took the elevator up to the 4th floor in complete isolation. As I walked down the main corridor toward my office, colleagues who had previously stopped by my desk every single morning suddenly found the beige carpeting utterly fascinating. Conversations abruptly died as I passed open cubicles. I stepped into my office and let the heavy glass door click shut behind me. The quiet in here was different. It was a vacuum. Sitting at my desk, staring blindly at the locked screen of my computer, the adrenaline finally receded, leaving behind a cold, hollow ache. The deepest wound from Weston's performance was not the public humiliation or the threat to my livelihood. It was the absolute, damning silence of my peers. Not one person had spoken up. 12 years of loyalty, of covering their mistakes, of fighting for their budgets, completely erased in 30 seconds of corporate theater. My desk phone blinked. It was not a call, but an automated calendar notification. A new meeting had been forced onto my schedule for 10 minutes from now. The location was Conference Room 3 in the Human Resources Suite. The title was simply Alignment Check-In. Sabrina Cole, the head of Human Resources, was waiting for me. Sabrina was a master of weaponized empathy. She wore soft pastel colors, spoke in soothing, modulated tones, and could seamlessly terminate a single mother's healthcare benefits without ever breaking eye contact or raising her voice. When I stepped into the room, I immediately noticed the second chair was occupied. Weston Pike was sitting in the corner, legs casually crossed, typing on his phone as if he were merely killing time between flights. "Melody, please, have a seat," Sabrina said, gesturing to the chair opposite her with a warm, entirely fabricated smile. "I wanted to pull you in quickly just to take the temperature in the room. Transitions are always challenging, and we want to ensure you are feeling supported during this structural pivot." Every word out of her mouth was a carefully constructed trap. If I expressed anger, I would be documented as hostile and unstable. If I expressed compliance, I would be consenting to my own execution. "I am perfectly fine, Sabrina," I replied, keeping my voice flat and completely devoid of inflection. Though I admit, the methodology of the town hall was highly unusual. Weston finally looked up from his screen. He slid his phone into the inner pocket of his suit jacket and leaned forward, resting his elbows on the glass table. "Let us be completely transparent, Melody," he said, his voice dripping with condescending patience. "Change is uncomfortable. Nora Holloway's sudden appearance was a disruption, We all respect Nora deeply for what she built a decade ago, but we cannot let an emotional outburst from an absentee founder derail the critical roadmap established by the executive board. He was establishing the narrative right there in front of me. Nora was not a savior. She was a hysterical, out-of-touch relic who had temporarily interrupted the adults in the room. Sabrina smoothly picked up the thread. The board is 100% committed to the automation initiative. Because of the friction generated this morning, we need to establish some temporary boundaries. Effective immediately, your employment status is under administrative review. Under review, I repeated slowly, letting the clinical taste of the words settle on my tongue. What exactly does that mean for my daily operations? It means we are pausing your authorization matrix, Sabrina explained, her voice softening into a grotesque imitation of sympathy. You will continue to receive your full salary and benefits, of course. However, your access to the financial dashboards, vendor approvals, and team management portals is temporarily suspended. We want to give you space to breathe while we evaluate where your skill set might fit into the new paradigm. They were severing my hands while smiling at my face. I was still employed on paper, but I was entirely neutralized. I possessed no power, no data access, and no ability to influence the department I had built. I understand, I said. It was the safest, most impenetrable phrase I could offer. Excellent, Weston said, standing up and smoothing his tie. I am glad we are all aligned. Take the rest of the day to process. Melody, we will circle back soon. I left the human resources suite feeling as though the air had been slowly pumped out of my lungs. The carpeted hallway seemed to stretch on forever. Just as I reached the elevator bank, my personal cell phone buzzed in my pocket. I pulled it out. It was a text message from a blocked number. The message contained only 2 sentences. They need to weaken you before Thursday. This is not just a firing. I stopped walking. I stared at the glowing pixels on the screen until they blurred. Thursday. Today was Tuesday. I had exactly 48 hours before whatever trap Weston had set finally snapped shut. The text was not a warning from a friend. It felt more like a breadcrumb dropped by someone who needed me to stay in the game just a little bit longer. When I finally returned to my office, the blinds facing the main floor were drawn shut. I pushed the door open to find Eli Mercer standing near my bookcase. His hands shoved deep into his pockets, his shoulders hunched up by his ears. He looked exactly like a child waiting to be reprimanded in the principal's office. "What are you doing in here, Eli?" I asked. My voice was utterly devoid of warmth. He flinched as if I had struck him. "I sneaked in. I did not want anyone on the floor to see me walking into your office. Melody, I am so sorry. I swear to you, I had no idea he was going to put your name on the big screen like that. It was sick. But you knew about the restructuring," I stated, not asking a question. I walked around him and sat behind my desk, folding my hands neatly over my legal pad. "You had a printed role description sitting on your lap." Eli swallowed hard, his Adam's apple bobbing nervously. The pristine confidence of his newly acquired business degree had completely evaporated. "Weston pulled me into a closed-door meeting 2 weeks ago. He told me the entire legacy system was being scrapped. He said it was a board mandate, that it was inevitable. He told me that if I backed his automation model, if I helped smooth the transition for the junior staff, I would be named the new director. And a 30% salary increase," I added softly, recalling the standard bump for that pay grade. He looked down at his expensive leather shoes. "Yes, I am drowning in student debt. Melody, you know that. Weston made it sound like you were stepping down gracefully. He said you were being offered a massive severance package to retire early. By the time I realized what he was actually doing, the town hall had already started. If I spoke up, he would have fired me on the spot." I looked at the young man I had mentored, the kid I had spent hundreds of hours training. He had traded my career for a title he was not qualified to hold. "You can leave now." "Eli," I said, my tone perfectly even. "Melody, please, you have to believe me." I said leave. He opened his mouth to offer another pathetic justification, but the look in my eyes stopped him cold. He turned and slipped out the door as quickly and quietly as he had entered, ensuring no one saw him leaving the quarantine zone. That night, I sat alone in the dark of my living room. The heavy rain from the morning had turned into a steady, freezing drizzle against the window panes. I did not pour a glass of wine. I did not cry. Crying was a biological response to sudden loss, and I had moved far past the initial shock. Instead, I sat in the stillness and mentally reconstructed the entire day. I reviewed every single face, every subtle gesture, every carefully chosen word. Weston Pike was an arrogant man, but he was not a sloppy one. Publicly executing a senior director in front of the entire company was a massive human resources risk. It practically invited a hostile work environment lawsuit. Unless, of course, the public spectacle was the entire point. They did not just want me gone. A standard layoff would have been quiet, handled with a severance agreement and a non-disclosure clause. By turning me into a pariah, by branding me as the singular friction point holding the company back, Weston had successfully destroyed my credibility. If I tried to speak out, if I tried to blow the whistle on whatever internal disaster they were brewing, nobody would listen. I would just look like a bitter, obsolete employee lashing out because she could not adapt to the future. The anonymous text message flashed in my mind again. They were trying to weaken me before Thursday. I leaned forward in the dark, resting my chin on my hands. I was stripped of my access, isolated from my team, and painted as a villain. The trap had been meticulously designed to bury me under a mountain of corporate shame. But Weston had made one critical miscalculation. He assumed the shame would break me. He assumed I would take the administrative leave, hide in my apartment, and quietly fade away to protect my ego. He did not realize that by taking away my daily responsibilities, he had just given me all the time in the world to figure out exactly how to tear his new empire down. I pulled into the parking garage at 5:30 in the morning on Wednesday. The concrete structure was hollow and silent, bathed in the sickly yellow glow of sodium vapor lights. My tires echoed loudly as I drove up to the 4th level. I knew human resources and the IT department would not process the complete revocation of my system credentials until at least 8 or 9 in the morning. Administrative suspensions were rarely executed with military precision. There was always a lag, a twilight zone of bureaucratic delay. I intended to exploit every single minute of it. I swiped my badge at the side entrance. The heavy door clicked unlocked. I walked through the darkened corridors, ignoring the motion sensor lights that woke up sluggishly overhead. I did not turn on the main overhead lights in my office. The glow of my monitor was enough. I woke up my computer and launched the legacy database. It spun for what felt like an eternity, the little loading icon mocking my racing heart, before finally dropping me into the main dashboard. I was in. My first target was the executive communication logs. I bypassed the main inbox and dug directly into the archived routing requests. It took me 20 minutes of parsing through dense, corporate jargon to find the thread. It was a chain of authorization requests initiated by Weston and rapidly approved by Marissa Bell, our chief financial officer. The subject lines were innocuous, masked as structural realignments, but the attachments told a different story. For the past 6 weeks, Weston and Marissa had been systematically transferring administrative ownership of the Tier 1 refund processing accounts and the master vendor rating matrices out of my jurisdiction. They were moving the financial control levers into a siloed directory that only the executive suite could access. I needed to see what they were doing with that control. I opened the comparative performance dashboard, the exact data set Weston had used to publicly hang me. I exported the raw logs for the entire quarter, pulling the individual case files instead of the aggregated summaries. It took an hour of cross-referencing, but the architecture of the lie slowly emerged on my screen. For the past 2 months, the routing algorithm had been quietly manipulated. Every single simple, low-risk, single-item return was automatically funneled to Weston's new artificial intelligence pilot program. The AI was processing pristine data, handling cases that required zero human judgment. Therefore, its success rate looked flawless. operating at nearly 100% efficiency. Meanwhile, my team's queue had been deliberately poisoned. Every complex dispute, every high-risk fraud flag, every multi-million-dollar vendor chargeback anomaly had been manually overridden and dumped onto my floor. The system was designed to choke us. My analysts were drowning in the most labor-intensive, legally sensitive cases the company had ever seen. Our processing times skyrocketed because we were doing the actual, grueling work of protecting the company's bottom line, while the automation software was essentially taking credit for breathing. They had manufactured the bottleneck. They had deliberately sabotaged my department's metrics to justify the purge. The cold, analytical part of my brain took over entirely. The lingering sting of betrayal from yesterday vanished, replaced by the sharp, focused energy of an auditor finding a discrepancy in the ledger. If they were willing to manipulate operational data to win a power struggle, what else were they hiding in the blind spots? I pivoted my search toward the vendor disbursement logs. I ran a query for any new third-party integrations added within the last 90 days. A dozen names popped up, mostly standard software-as-a-service subscriptions. But one entry sitting near the bottom of the list caught my attention. Northline Process Lab. The vendor profile was remarkably sparse. There was no physical address listed, only a post office box in Delaware. There was no dedicated account manager name, just a generic support email. Yet, according to the accounts payable ledger, Northline had received 3 separate payments of $85,000 over the last 3 months. $255,000 had been wired out of the company for a service I had never heard of. I pulled up the system architecture map. If Northline was providing operational software, there had to be an integration node. There was nothing, no application programming interface keys, no network handshakes, no data flowing in or out of their supposed platform. The vendor was a ghost. They were bleeding cash out of the company under the guise of technological modernization. I needed to know who authorized those payments. I clicked into the master approval registry, filtering the results by the Northline vendor identification number. The screen loaded. I stared at the digital signature attached to the final release of funds. A wave of genuine nausea washed over me. The digital footprint belonged to my own administrative account. I checked the timestamps. The first approval was logged at 2 a.m. on a Sunday. The second happened while I was on a commercial flight to a logistics conference in Chicago. The third was stamped just 4 days ago, right in the middle of a board presentation where I had not even opened my laptop. I had never seen these invoices. I had never authorized these transfers. Someone had spoofed my security token. The true shape of the trap finally materialized in the dark office. Weston and Marissa were not just pushing me out to clear a path for their new software. They were building a firewall made of human flesh. When the phantom payments to Northline Process Lab were eventually discovered, when the missing funds triggered an external audit, the trail would not lead to the executive suite. It would lead directly to the disgruntled, terminated director of returns processing. They were laying the groundwork to frame me for massive corporate fraud. They needed me gone, stripped of my access, and thoroughly discredited before the quarterly numbers were finalized. That was why they needed to humiliate me. Who would believe a bitter, fired employee who claimed her credentials were stolen? I would look like a desperate criminal trying to cover her tracks. I glanced at the digital clock in the corner of my monitor. It was 7:15 in the morning. The building was starting to wake up. I could hear the faint hum of the elevators in the distance. I had perhaps 30 minutes before Sabrina Cole or a security guard realized my badge had swiped into the building. I did not panic. I moved with absolute, terrifying precision. I opened a secure, encrypted cloud drive I had built for personal emergency backups years ago, totally detached from the corporate network. I began dragging the raw data files over. I copied the manipulated routing logs, proving the AI queue was rigged. I downloaded the entire email chain between Weston and Marissa detailing the transfer of financial controls. I pulled the raw server access logs that clearly showed my authentication token being pinged from a virtual private network IP address that did not belong to my workstation, definitively proving the Northline approvals were forged. Digital files were good, but physical paper was harder to accidentally delete. I fired up the heavy-duty laser printer in the corner of my office. I fed it reams of paper, printing hard copies of the forged approval forms, the vendor payment histories, and the internal performance dashboards. The machine whirred and hummed, spitting out the irrefutable architecture of their crimes. I took a thick black marker and redacted my own passwords, organizing the papers into a thick manila envelope. By the time the clock struck 7:45, my desk was completely clear. The encrypted drive was safely tucked into my coat pocket. The manila envelope was secured in my leather briefcase. I logged out of the legacy system, watching the screen return to the generic corporate login portal. I walked to the window and opened the blinds, letting the gray morning light filter into the room. I stood there, looking out at the rain-slicked streets. I was no longer a victim of a corporate restructuring. I was no longer a casualty of office politics. I was a liability they had failed to properly secure. Weston thought he was playing a game of perception, relying on the psychological weight of public shame to keep me quiet and compliant. He thought I would react with hurt and retreat. He was wrong. I was not going to defend my legacy, and I was certainly not going to beg for my job back. I was going to let him continue building his fragile, arrogant empire, completely unaware that I was standing in the shadows, holding the exact sledgehammer required to shatter his foundation into a million pieces. I picked up my briefcase, the weight of the evidence grounding me, and walked out of the office before the first executive even pulled into the parking lot. I was ready for Thursday. I drove 45 minutes away from the corporate plaza, heading deep into the industrial outskirts, where the sleek glass architecture of our business district gave way to crumbling asphalt and rusted chain-link fences. The diner was an unnamed, dilapidated relic from the 1980s, tucked between a failing tire shop and a vacant lot. The neon sign hanging in the window had burned out years ago. The interior smelled permanently of stale grease, bleached mops, and old coffee. Weston Pike and his polished circle of executives would rather walk barefoot over broken glass than step foot inside a place like this. That was exactly why I chose it. I found Nora Holloway sitting in a booth at the very back, half hidden by the shadows cast from a flickering overhead fluorescent tube. She had traded her soaked trench coat from yesterday for a high-collared, dark wool sweater that seemed to swallow her thin frame. Without the theatrical lighting of the auditorium and the sheer force of her sudden entrance, the physical toll of her prolonged absence was glaringly obvious. Her skin was translucent, pulling tightly across her cheekbones. Yet, her dark eyes remained as sharp and unforgiving as obsidian. I slid into the cracked vinyl seat across from her. A tired waitress approached, dropped 2 chipped ceramic mugs of black coffee on the laminated table without saying a word, and shuffled away. "You look exactly the same as you did 5 years ago, Melody," Nora said. Her voice was quiet, lacking the booming resonance it had in the boardroom, but it carried a heavy gravitational pull. "Still keeping your armor polished. Still observing every exit in the room before you sit down." "Survival habit," I replied, wrapping my cold hands around the hot ceramic mug. "I assume we are not here to reminisce about my posture. Why did you really step into that town hall yesterday?" Nora did not smile. She took a slow, measured sip of her coffee. "I was out for 8 months, a severe mitral valve failure. I spent 3 months in a hospital bed attached to machines, and another 5 months locked in my house trying to regain the ability to walk up a flight of stairs without losing my breath. In the corporate world, an 8-month vacuum is blood in the water. Weston and the board assumed I was simply waiting to die quietly. They certainly moved quickly to erase your founding principles," I noted flatly. "They did more than that." Nora leaned forward, the ambient diner noise seeming to fade into the background. "The board of directors is under extreme pressure. We are bleeding institutional investors. To stop the hemorrhage, they are quietly pushing through a majority stake acquisition. Redcrest Capital is preparing to buy a controlling 60% of Brightridge. The board intends to sign the binding term sheets in exactly 10 days. The puzzle pieces began slamming together in my mind, forming a terrifying, massive picture. Redcrest Capital was a notoriously aggressive private equity firm, They did not buy companies to build them. They bought them to gut them, streamline them, and flip them. Weston is dressing the bride, I said, the realization settling like a stone in my stomach. Precisely, Nora confirmed, her gaze unwavering. Weston promised the acquisition team that he could completely sanitize our operational footprint. He pitched them a narrative. He told them he could eradicate the costly, bloated legacy personnel, slash our manual processing overhead by 80%, and replace it all with a frictionless, automated artificial intelligence engine. He promised to deliver a remarkably lean, high-margin machine before the ink on the Redcrest deal even dries. That is impossible, I countered, my voice hardening with professional certainty. Reverse logistics is not a clean, linear equation. It is a massive liability minefield. If Weston simply automates the dispute queues and fires the veteran staff, the system will blind approve fraudulent returns. If he mishandles the vendor reserve accounts and the chargeback ratios, the financial blowback will not be a minor error. It will be a catastrophic failure. The company will owe tens of millions of dollars to our supply chain partners within a single fiscal quarter. Brightridge will detonate right in Redcrest's hands. I know that, Nora said softly. And you know that. But the private equity partners do not look at the messy reality of the warehouse floor. They look at Weston's beautifully sanitized slide decks. Weston and his faction have spent the last 6 months building a flawless narrative about how veteran employees are holding the company back. You were not put on that screen yesterday just to be fired. Melody, you were put there to be the sacrificial lamb. You are the physical embodiment of the obsolete friction Weston is promising to eliminate. I reached down to the floor, resting my hand on the leather handle of my briefcase. Inside sat the printed logs, the forged approval signatures, and the phantom payments to Northline Process Lab. I had enough paper in that bag to send Weston to federal prison. But I looked across the table at the woman who had founded the company. Nora was brilliant, but she was deeply compromised. Her health was failing. The board had clearly outmaneuvered her. She was isolated. If I handed her the full scope of the embezzlement right now, she might use it immediately to try and reclaim her throne. She might confront Weston prematurely. Or worse, she might use my evidence as leverage to negotiate her own golden parachute with Redcrest, leaving me completely defenseless. Trust was a luxury I could no longer afford. I popped the brass latches of my briefcase. I reached inside and pulled out a thin, carefully selected blue folder. I slid it across the sticky table. "What is this?" Nora asked, not touching the folder. "A fraction of the truth," I answered. "These are the raw routing logs from the last 60 days. They prove Weston and Marissa Bell manually manipulated the workflow architecture. They funneled every single high-risk, complex dispute directly to my team to artificially inflate our processing time, while feeding only the simplest, zero-risk cases to their new software. The Bottleneck was entirely manufactured. They engineered a crisis to justify the purge." Nora opened the folder. Her eyes scanned the printed spreadsheets, her expression unreadable. She understood the data instantly. She closed the folder and rested her hand flat on top of it. "This is compelling," she said, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "But it is an operational grievance. Weston will claim it was a necessary load balancing test for the new software. It is not enough to stop the Redcrest deal." "It is a start," I replied, my tone leaving absolutely no room for negotiation. "I am not giving you everything I have, not yet. I need to know who is standing beside you on that board, and I need to know they are not on Weston's payroll." Nora studied my face for a long, silent moment. She did not argue. She recognized the boundary I had drawn. "You are playing a very dangerous game of attrition, Melody," Nora warned, leaning back against the vinyl seat. "Do not mistake my theatrical entrance yesterday for a full pardon. I stopped the public bleeding, but I did not remove the target on your back. By keeping you employed, by putting you on administrative leave instead of firing you outright, Weston now has the perfect captive audience. He will spend the next week building a paper trail so dense that when the Redcrest deal closes, he will not just terminate you, He will bury you." "Let him try," I said. I finished the last sip of my bitter coffee and stood up from the booth. "I will be in touch. Nora, stay out of the office. Let them think you are still recovering." I turned and walked away before she could offer another word of caution. I pushed through the heavy glass door of the diner, stepping out into the biting, damp wind. The rain had stopped, leaving the gray sky hanging low over the desolate street. I pulled my coat tight against my chest and began walking toward my car, parked halfway down the block. The gravel crunched loudly beneath my boots. The industrial avenue was completely deserted. There were no pedestrians, no open storefronts, and no traffic, except for one vehicle. Parked diagonally across the street, tucked neatly into the shadow of a decaying brick warehouse, was a large, immaculately clean black sport utility vehicle. The windows were tinted so heavily they looked like solid slabs of obsidian. Its engine was not running, but I could see the faint, rhythmic glow of a dashboard screen illuminating the interior space behind the steering wheel. I did not stop walking. I did not break my stride or turn my head to stare. I kept my eyes fixed straight ahead, unlocking my car with the fob hidden inside my pocket. Weston was not just building a paper trail in the office. He was tracking my physical movements. He knew exactly where I was. He knew I had just spent an hour sitting in a forgotten diner with the exiled founder of the company. The cold realization washed over me, chilling my blood faster than the winter wind. The corporate veil had fully lifted. We were no longer fighting over severance packages or organizational charts. I climbed into my car, locked the doors, and stared at the black vehicle through my rearview mirror. The trap was much larger than I had anticipated, and the people hunting me had no intention of letting me walk away quietly. The drive back to the corporate campus felt like a slow descent into a submerged cage. The black sport utility vehicle had vanished from the diner, but the phantom weight of its presence pressed heavily against my chest. When I walked through the towering glass doors of the main lobby at 10:15, the atmosphere had shifted. The usual low hum of morning greetings was absent. Instead, two broad-shouldered security guards in dark gray suits stood flanking the main elevator bank. They were not our usual front desk personnel. They watched my approach with flat, unblinking eyes. I swiped my badge. The light flashed green, but one of the guards subtly shifted his weight, closing the physical gap between us by a fraction of an inch as I stepped onto the elevator. They were making sure I went exactly where I was supposed to go. When I reached the 4th floor and pushed open the heavy glass door to my office, the finality of the situation greeted me before a single word was spoken. Sitting dead center on my polished mahogany desk was a flat, unassembled brown cardboard box. My computer screens were completely black. The glowing green light on the hard drive tower was dead. I reached out and tapped the spacebar. Nothing happened. They had severed the umbilical cord. "We had to move quickly, Melody." I turned. Sabrina Cole was standing in the doorway. She was not smiling this time. The weaponized empathy had been replaced by a tight, practiced mask of corporate risk management. She held a silver tablet pressed against her chest like a shield. "Your administrative review has been escalated to a formal suspension pending a security investigation," Sabrina said, her voice dropping to a soft, lethal register designed to prevent the sound from carrying into the hallway. "Our automated compliance monitors flagged severe anomalies this morning. You are being officially cited for accessing sensitive financial data outside the scope of your current duties and unauthorized sharing of proprietary information with external parties." They knew I had downloaded the logs at dawn. They knew I had met with Nora Holloway. Weston was not just reacting. He was suffocating my every move. "An investigation implies a search for the truth." "Sabrina," I replied, my voice steady despite the adrenaline spiking in my veins. "That box on my desk suggests the verdict was printed before the jury was even selected. It is standard protocol to offer a receptacle for personal effects during a suspension," she countered smoothly, avoiding my gaze by looking down at her tablet. "Security will escort you out of the building in exactly 15 minutes. I strongly advise you not to speak with any other personnel on your way out. It will only complicate your legal standing." She turned on her heel and walked away, leaving me entirely alone with the cardboard box. I did not pack my framed degrees or the expensive pen set on my desk. I grabbed only my coat and my purse. As I slung my bag over my shoulder, my personal cell phone vibrated violently against my hip. I pulled it out. It was not a text message this time. It was an email sent to my private, non-corporate address from a heavily encrypted account. The subject line was empty. The body of the message contained a single sentence and a highly complex web address string. Look at the rook directory before they wipe the backup servers completely. I tapped the link. The screen on my phone transitioned to a stark, unbranded login portal. A set of temporary credentials populated automatically. I hit enter. A hidden, mirrored directory of the company's archived file system loaded on my small screen. It was a graveyard of deleted contracts and bypassed workflows. I scrolled down until I found a folder simply labeled Rook. My thumb hovered over the screen, my pulse drumming a frantic rhythm. I opened the folder. Inside were dozens of PDF files. I tapped the most recent one. It was a finalized service agreement for a vendor I did not recognize. I scrolled straight to the bottom of the document to find the authorization signature. It was Eli Mercer's digital signature. I opened another file, then another. They were all high-dollar, unverified vendor approvals, and every single one of them bore Eli's digital footprint. I checked the digital timestamps. Every signature had been generated after the specific date Weston had promised Eli his massive promotion. The sheer, sociopathic brilliance of Weston's plan snapped into excruciating focus. I had assumed I was the only scapegoat. I was wrong. Weston was building a two-tiered execution. I was going to be framed as the disgruntled, obsolete director who leaked proprietary data out of spite. I was the security threat, but Eli was the technical operator. Weston was using the kid's shiny new access credentials to quietly sign off on all the toxic, fraudulent agreements required to make the automated system look profitable before the Redcrest Capital acquisition closed. When the inevitable audit hit, Weston would simply point to me as the vengeful mastermind and Eli as my corrupt, inexperienced accomplice. We would both take the fall, shielding the executive suite from federal indictments. Eli thought he was buying a golden ticket. He had actually signed his own death warrant. I pocketed my phone, ignored the empty cardboard box, and walked out of my office. The two security guards materialized at the end of the hallway the moment I stepped out. They escorted me into the elevator and stood on either side of me in absolute, suffocating silence as we descended to the parking garage. They watched me until I unlocked my car, then turned and walked back inside the building. The air in the concrete garage was damp and heavy. I opened my car door, tossing my purse onto the passenger seat. Melody. The voice came from the shadows between a concrete pillar and a silver luxury sedan. Marissa Bell stepped into the dim fluorescent light. Our chief financial officer wore a pristine white trench coat, looking entirely out of place in the grimy parking structure. She glanced nervously toward the security cameras mounted on the ceiling before taking 2 quick steps toward me. "I only have a minute," Marissa whispered, her tone laced with a brittle, frantic energy that I had never heard from her before. "Do not fight this. You are outmatched. The board is fully aligned behind Weston. You do not have the resources to survive a protracted legal battle with this company. Did you follow me down here to offer career advice, Marissa?" I asked, keeping my hand firmly gripped on my open car door. "Or are you just making sure the dead body is actually in the ground?" She ignored the bite in my voice. She reached into her pocket and pulled out a thick, sealed envelope. "There is a severance package in here. It is extremely generous. $150,000, fully vested options, and 6 months of extended health coverage. All you have to do is sign the non-disclosure agreement. Take the money. Melody. Disappear for a while. Let everything cool down. If you walk away quietly right now, nobody comes after you." I looked at the crisp white envelope in her trembling hand. It was a bribe disguised as a life raft. If I signed that non-disclosure agreement, I would be legally gagged. I would be trapped. completely unable to defend myself when they inevitably activated the fraudulent paper trail they were building against me and Eli. You and Weston moved too much dirt to hide the hole. Marissa, I said softly, staring directly into her wide, anxious eyes. You spoofed my approval token for the Northline Process Lab payments. You are using Eli to rubber stamp the garbage contracts. You are not offering me a severance package. You are offering me a gag order so I cannot scream when you throw me off the cliff. Marissa's face went entirely pale. The brittle energy vanished, replaced by sheer, unfiltered panic. She realized in that exact moment that I had seen the ledger. You are going to destroy yourself, she hissed, her voice vibrating with fear. She shoved the envelope back into her pocket and took a step back into the shadows. He will ruin you. Tell Weston, I replied, my voice as cold and hard as the concrete floor beneath my feet, that my price is much higher than $150,000. I climbed into my car and slammed the door. I started the engine and drove out of the garage, the blinding afternoon sunlight hitting my windshield as I merged onto the highway. I was officially locked out of the castle. They thought I was on the run, but I was not running. I drove straight to a specialized electronics store 3 towns over. I purchased a heavy-duty encrypted hard drive and a clean laptop paid entirely in cash. I sat in the parking lot of a quiet suburban library, connected to their public wireless network using a virtual private network, and built a secure, untraceable command center. I moved every single downloaded file, every intercepted email, and every screenshot of Eli's forged signatures into an impenetrable digital vault. Weston Pike wanted a silent execution. He wanted me to fade away out of shame and fear. He had miscalculated the fundamental nature of the woman he was trying to bury. I was no longer playing defense. I was laying the explosives, preparing for a war that would burn his polished corporate empire to the ground. At exactly 8 o'clock on Thursday morning, my encrypted burner phone rang. The voice on the other end belonged to Dana Sloan. She was an independent forensic auditor, brought in at the direct request of Nora Holloway, and the only external member of the board of directors who had not yet been completely seduced by Weston Pike's promises of unprecedented profit margins. Dana did not ask how I was doing. She did not offer false sympathies regarding my public suspension. She simply provided an address for a neutral, glass-walled conference room located in a high-security corporate suites building downtown, far away from the Bright Ridge campus. She wanted to see the architecture of the fire I claimed was burning inside the company. I arrived 20 minutes early. I did not bring the encrypted hard drive, knowing that connecting a foreign device to an auditor's machine would immediately trigger a chain of custody dispute. Instead, I brought the physical paper. I carried a heavy black leather briefcase containing 3 perfectly organized binders. Inside those binders were the system logs, the redundant copies of the performance dashboards, the printed email threads requesting elevated access permissions, the granular vendor profile edit histories, and the meticulous handwritten notes I had compiled in the quiet, desperate hours following the town hall execution. Dana Sloan sat at the head of a long, polished oak table. She wore a sharp gray suit and possessed the clinical, unblinking gaze of a professional who spent her life dissecting corporate lies. She did not offer me coffee. She just pointed to the empty chair across from her. I have been fully briefed by Human Resources regarding your administrative suspension. Melody, Dana stated, her voice flat and entirely devoid of emotion. The official narrative is that you are a disgruntled, obsolete director who began unlawfully extracting proprietary data when you realized your position was being phased out by automation. I need you to prove to me, using only verifiable metrics, that this narrative is a fabrication. I did not waste time defending my character. Character was subjective. Mathematics was not. I unclasped my briefcase and slid the first binder across the table. I opened it to a heavily tabbed section containing the dashboard copies. I am not here to argue about office politics, Dana, I said, keeping my tone as cold and precise as hers. I am here to show you a deliberate, systemic model of data distortion. Look at page 4. That is the historical routing logic for my department prior to the 1st of October. We handled a naturally blended queue of reverse logistics. 30% of those cases were high risk, complex disputes requiring manual investigation. 70% were standard, low risk returns. Dana adjusted her wire rimmed glasses, tracing the printed graphs with the tip of a silver pen. Standard distribution for an enterprise of this size. Now look at page 7, I instructed, turning the document over. This is the snapshot of the allocation logic pulled during the second week of November, exactly when Weston Pike launched his artificial intelligence pilot program. Notice the variance. Dana's eyes narrowed as she absorbed the numbers. The silver pen stopped moving. The volume of your high-risk manual review cases spiked by over 400% in a single week. The standard, low-risk volume completely vanished from your queue. It did not vanish, I corrected her quietly. It was manually rerouted. Weston and our chief financial officer, Marissa Bell, altered the routing algorithm. They starved my human team of the easy high-volume cases that keep our aggregate processing times low. They took every single pristine zero-risk return and fed it directly to the new software. Meanwhile, every fraudulent claim, every multi-million-dollar vendor dispute, and every toxic chargeback was dumped onto my floor. They engineered a severe operational backlog to create the illusion that my department was failing, while artificially inflating the success rate of the automation pilot to an impossible 99%. Dana looked up from the paper, her clinical detachment giving way to the sharp, focused energy of a hunter catching a scent. She recognized instantly that this was not a petty human resources conflict. This was a calculated manipulation of corporate valuation metrics. Before Dana could ask her next question, the heavy glass door of the conference room was shoved open with violently excessive force. Weston Pike marched into the room. He was breathing heavily, his usually immaculate hair slightly disheveled. The polished, charismatic executive who had humiliated me on a 50-foot screen was gone. In his place was a man desperately trying to plug a hole in a sinking ship. He had clearly leveraged his security contacts to track Dana's location. "Dana," Weston snapped, his voice tight with forced authority. "I was just informed by my compliance team that you requested an off-site audience with a suspended employee. I must strongly advise against factoring any of this into your audit. Melody Walker is currently under an active, high-level security investigation for corporate espionage. Anything she hands you is legally compromised." I did not flinch. I did not stand up to match his aggressive posture. I remained perfectly seated, folding my hands neatly on the table. The urge to scream at him, to hurl every ounce of my accumulated rage at his face, was overwhelming. But I knew that anger was the exact weapon he wanted me to use. If I shouted, I became the hysterical, bitter employee he claimed I was. Instead, I shifted the battleground away from emotion and entirely into the realm of undeniable data. "You do not have to trust a single piece of paper I brought into this room. Dana," I said, my voice cutting through Weston's bluster with razor-sharp clarity. "Close my binders. Open your own secure terminal. Log directly into the Brightridge master server right now. Pull the raw, unfiltered case allocation ratios from the third quarter and compare them directly to the first 4 weeks of the fourth quarter. Do the math yourself." Weston stepped forward, slamming his hand flat against the oak table. "I absolutely forbid external database queries outside of the approved audit scope. This is a severe breach of protocol." Dana did not even look at him. She opened her sleek silver laptop, connected to her encrypted mobile network, and began typing. Her fingers flew across the keyboard with punishing speed. "My mandate comes directly from the independent board committee. Weston, you do not dictate my scope. If the operational metrics are as clean as you promised the investors, you have absolutely nothing to fear from a simple historical data pull." The silence in the room became thick and suffocating. Weston stood frozen, a muscle ticking violently in his jaw. He was trapped in a purely logical corner. He could not physically close her laptop without committing a corporate crime in front of an independent auditor. For 10 agonizing minutes, The only sound was the rapid clicking of Dana's keyboard. I watched the reflection of the data scrolling across the lenses of her glasses. Finally, she stopped typing. She took a slow, deep breath and turned her laptop screen just enough so Weston could see the glaring red anomaly illuminated on the display. "The statistical variance is an absolute impossibility," Dana pronounced, her voice carrying the heavy, fatal weight of a judge delivering a verdict. "Consumer return patterns do not spontaneously alter themselves by 400% in a matter of days. The system architecture was intentionally reconfigured. The human operators were deliberately overloaded." She closed her laptop with a sharp snap and looked directly into Weston's pale face. "This is not a software optimization test, Weston," Dana stated coldly. "This is a deliberate, highly sophisticated distortion of operational efficiency. This specific type of data manipulation is the exact signature of a management team fraudulently inflating the health of a company to pass due diligence for a massive external acquisition." Weston opened his mouth, desperately searching for a corporate buzzword, a spin, or a technical excuse to explain away the math. But the structural integrity of his lie had been shattered. He turned on his heel and walked out of the conference room without saying a single word, the heavy glass door swinging shut behind him. Dana pulled my binders toward her side of the table. "I am placing these documents into secure forensic custody. Melody, do not return to the corporate campus. Do not speak to anyone on the executive team. The board will be notified of my preliminary findings by midnight." I nodded, packing up my empty briefcase. I had won the battle of logic, but as I walked out of the high-security building and stepped onto the busy downtown sidewalk, I knew Weston would not simply surrender. Cornered animals were always the most dangerous. I reached into my coat pocket to retrieve my car keys. My burner phone vibrated against my palm. It was a text message from Eli Mercer. The text was jagged, rushed, and stripped of all professional formatting. "Melody, I am terrified. I dug through my deleted local files. I found the original draft of my new role description and the salary offer. The official personnel file they have on record claims my promotion was signed and authorized on the 12th of October, but the email attaching the actual draft was not sent to me until the 29th of October. They backdated my paperwork. They changed the timeline to make it look like I had senior system authority weeks before I actually did. My signature is on things I never even saw. Please tell me what to do." I stopped walking, the cold city wind biting at my face. The math had proved Weston was lying to the buyers, but Eli's trembling message proved something much darker. Weston was fully prepared to sacrifice his own people to the federal authorities just to ensure his golden parachute deployed on time. The truth was slowly coming to light, but the guillotine was still hanging directly over our heads. 2 days after my meeting with the auditor, I found myself standing in the sprawling, dimly lit library of Nora Holloway's private estate. The heavy scent of old paper and wood smoke filled the room. Dana Sloan was already there, her silver laptop glowing starkly against the antique mahogany desk. We were no longer simply looking at internal operational data. The perimeter of the conspiracy had expanded violently outward. Dana turned her screen toward me. She opened a confidential strategy document. The title page did not bear the Bright Ridge logo. It belonged to an elite, ruthless management consulting firm retained exclusively by Redcrest Capital. The creation date stamped at the bottom was from 6 months ago. "Read the third bullet point on the executive summary," Dana instructed, her tone devoid of any softness. I leaned in. The text was highlighted in yellow. It outlined a mandate to aggressively streamline operations, specifically citing the need to, and I read the exact phrase, "eliminate the bottleneck of manual processing protocols." The air in my lungs turned to ice. Weston Pike had not even written his own execution speech. He was not a visionary modernizing a company. He was merely an actor reading a script handed to him by the private equity firm preparing to buy us. The ground beneath my feet shifted entirely. I had spent the last 48 hours believing I was targeted because I was an obstacle to Weston's ego and his faulty software. That was too small. I was an obstacle to a narrative that had been written half a year before I even knew I was in danger. Weston and our chief financial officer, Marissa Bell, needed to prove to the buyers that the legacy system was actively burning massive amounts of cash. By publicly painting me as a rigid, costly burden, they created the perfect justification to terminate veteran staff, seize absolute control over the internal data architecture, and wildly inflate the projected savings of their new automated model. They are dressing the corpse to look like a bride, I said, the magnitude of the lie finally taking shape. And they are getting paid a fortune to do it, Dana added. She pulled up a separate financial prospectus. If Weston and Marissa deliver Brightridge to Redcrest with these artificially lean operating margins, their executive retention bonuses and performance payouts will trigger automatically upon the closing of the sale. We are talking about mid-eight-figure payouts for both of them. When the acquisition finalized, Weston would cash a check large enough to buy an island. The real damage, the millions of dollars in unprocessed chargebacks, and the toxic, fraudulent vendor approvals that Eli Mercer was currently being forced to sign, would not detonate until months later. By the time the new owners realized they had purchased a ticking time bomb, the architects of the disaster would be untouchable. "What about Calvin?" I asked, looking up at Nora. Calvin Rusk was our chief executive officer. I had assumed he was the mastermind, or at least a willing co-conspirator. Nora shook her head slowly, her silhouette framed by the dying fire in the hearth. "Calvin is a salesman, Melody. He is not an operator. He only looks at the top-level metrics. Weston and Marissa have been feeding him doctored dashboards since the beginning of the third quarter. He genuinely believes this restructuring is an unavoidable evolution. They completely isolated him from the raw data. Calvin is the captain of the ship, blissfully unaware that his first mates have already sold the lifeboats to the highest bidder." Nora stepped closer to the desk, her dark eyes locking onto mine with a fierce, ancient intensity. "Do you want to know why I actually walked into that town hall? It was not just a founder's instinct. When Weston put your name on that screen, I remembered the Apex retail crisis from 5 years ago." A cold knot tightened in my stomach. 5 years ago, our largest retail partner attempted to initiate a massive, retroactive clawback that would have bankrupted Brightridge in a single afternoon. I had locked myself in a conference room for 3 straight weeks, manually tearing apart tens of thousands of reverse logistics claims to prove their financial modeling was entirely fraudulent. "You saved this company using the exact kind of granular, human analysis that Weston is now publicly condemning as obsolete," Nora continued, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "The night after the town hall, I used my dormant administrative access to check the internal policy library. The compliance memorandum you wrote after that crisis, the one establishing a mandatory human review protocol for all high-risk vendor disputes, is gone. It has been permanently wiped from the server." I stood frozen. They had not just fired me, they had retroactively erased my history. They deleted the evidence of my past success to ensure no one in the due diligence process could point to my protocols as proof that Weston's new automated system was recklessly dangerous. I was effectively erased from the corporate memory. Then, a new, sickening realization washed over me. My mind raced back to the auditorium, the specific choice of venue, the glaring red box on the 50-foot screen, the perfectly modulated, theatrical monologue about decisive leadership and cutting dead weight. It was entirely too performative for an internal staffing update. "The town hall," I breathed, my heart hammering against my ribs. "We always record the all-hands meetings to distribute to the regional satellite offices." Dana closed her laptop with a sharp, echoing snap. "And Weston controls the corporate media archive." The humiliation I endured was never just about destroying my credibility among my peers. It was raw footage. Weston was going to take that recording, edit out my shock and the uncomfortable, terrified silence of the staff, and package it into a sleek, high-definition highlight reel. He was going to sit in a velvet-lined boardroom with the private equity partners from Redcrest Capital and press play. He was going to use my public slaughter as absolute visual proof of his decisive, uncompromising leadership. I was not just a scapegoat for their fraud. I was the marketing collateral for their multi-million-dollar payday. The anger that had been simmering inside me instantly burned away, leaving behind a cold, absolute clarity. I was done reacting. It was time to close the trap around them. The corporate machine did not just stop at my physical exile. It immediately began the ruthless process of sanitizing my memory. Through the secure, encrypted channels I still quietly monitored from my suburban dining room, I watched the orchestrated narrative take root across the company network. Human Resources did not send out a formal memo regarding my departure. Instead, they quietly seeded the floor with strategic, weaponized gossip. I was no longer a victim of a sudden, brutal restructuring. In the span of 3 days, I was completely rewritten. I was described in hushed tones as deeply uncooperative, vehemently anti-innovation, and ultimately, a bitter veteran who lost her professional grip because she could not handle being replaced by superior technology. They were painting me as a hysterical Luddite standing in the way of progress. Then, late on Friday evening, my encrypted burner phone buzzed. It was Tessa Rowan. Tessa was a senior logistics manager I had personally hired 7 years ago, someone I had mentored and protected through multiple rounds of corporate layoffs. We met in the back of a dimly lit, completely empty grocery store parking lot on the edge of the city. The rain was falling in heavy, freezing sheets. When Tessa rolled down her car window, she looked physically ill. Her skin was pale, and her hands shook violently as she passed a heavily taped manila envelope through the narrow gap. She confessed, her voice cracking with raw shame, that Weston Pike had pulled her into a private meeting the day after my public execution. He offered her a $50,000 retention bonus on the explicit, non-negotiable condition that she cut all contact with me, sign a non-disclosure agreement, and publicly support the new automation rollout to the junior staff. Tessa told me she took the money because she had a crippling mortgage and a husband dealing with chronic medical debt. She chose survival over loyalty, but the guilt of watching me take the fall was eating her alive. Inside the envelope she handed me was a chronological, highly detailed list of every closed-door executive strategy session from the past 4 months. It was the exact architectural blueprint of my assassination. It detailed who attended, what was discussed, and how the plan to frame me was methodically built. I drove home, locked my doors, and did not sleep for the next 48 hours. I did not shed a single tear for Tessa's betrayal or my ruined reputation. Tears were a useless luxury for people who were not actively being hunted. I converted my living space into a cold, analytical war room. I pinned Tessa's meeting dates against the blank wall, running physical strings to cross-reference them with the forged vendor approvals and the altered performance dashboards Dana Sloan and I had extracted. I built a tangible web of their corporate crimes. I tracked exactly who approved what specific fraudulent invoice, at what exact hour of the night, from which specific IP address, and how every single piece of manufactured data perfectly supported the flawlessly lean narrative they were actively selling to Redcrest Capital. By early Sunday morning, Dana and her elite forensic technology team had successfully reconstructed the hidden metadata from the Bright Ridge backup servers. The results she sent over our secure connection were absolutely damning. The digital fingerprints on the most sensitive, backdated documents, including Eli Mercer's fraudulent promotion letter and the altered case routing algorithms, did not originate from the secure corporate network inside the building. Dana traced the administrative overrides directly back to a private virtual private network. It was Weston Pike's personal home network. He had been logging into the system from his luxury townhouse at 2 and 3 in the morning, bypassing all internal security protocols, manually editing the digital ledgers to construct his fake empire in the dark. I held enough explosive, irrefutable material in my hands to completely destroy Weston and our chief financial officer, Marissa Bell. I had a fleeting, tempting opportunity to anonymously leak the entire packet of evidence to the federal financial regulators or the national business press right then. It would have saved me immediately. The resulting public fallout and massive stock drop would have forced the board of directors to halt the acquisition and potentially reinstate me to stop the bleeding. But I refused to take the easy, loud exit. A public leak would just create a chaotic, uncontrollable corporate scandal. It would allow Weston and Marissa to hire incredibly expensive crisis management firms, spin the narrative, and potentially deflect the legal blame downward onto terrified, manipulated subordinates like Eli Mercer. I did not want a messy public brawl where the truth could be buried under expensive public relations statements. I wanted to walk directly into the absolute center of their power, look them in the eye, and lock the doors from the inside. Nora Holloway understood the assignment perfectly. Moving in absolute secrecy from her private estate, she bypassed Weston's strict calendar controls, utilizing her retained, overriding founder privileges. Nora called an emergency, mandatory session of the board of directors. She specifically scheduled the session for Tuesday at 1 in the afternoon. It was the exact same day, and the exact same hour, that the senior due diligence team from Redcrest Capital was slated to arrive at our headquarters for their final, binding walkthrough of the operational floor. Weston and Marissa were expecting a victory lap, a day to pop champagne, sign the final term sheets, and lock in their multi-million-dollar payouts. Instead, Nora was building a silent execution chamber right under their feet. However, Weston was a ruthless survivor, and I knew he would not walk into the final phase of a massive acquisition without a contingency plan to handle my ghost. Through my continuous encrypted monitoring of the executive's shared drives, I discovered the final card he intended to play if the board of directors or the buyers ever formally questioned my sudden, aggressive termination. It was a high-definition video file, meticulously edited and color-corrected by the corporate media team. The clip was pulled from a divisional planning meeting that took place 3 months ago. In the heavily spliced, 2-minute footage, I appeared incredibly angry, rigid, and combative. The video showed me loudly declaring that the new artificial intelligence protocol was a total disaster waiting to happen and that I absolutely refused to let it touch my department's workflows. Standing alone, stripped of all surrounding context, the video was the ultimate, undeniable proof of my toxic resistance. It was the perfect visual weapon designed to permanently label me as an anti-innovation dinosaur right in front of the Redcrest partners. He thought this edited video was his absolute, impenetrable shield. He did not realize that I had spent 12 years mastering the company's internal digital architecture. It took me 6 grueling hours of digging through the deepest, long-forgotten subdirectories of the master backup servers, bypassing 3 separate firewalls, but I finally found it. I found the raw, uncut, 2-hour recording of that exact same divisional meeting. I sat in the glow of my monitor and watched the full, unedited footage. I was not screaming. I was not blindly fighting the future. In the full context of the discussion, I calmly and firmly stated to the executive team that I fully supported the technological transition. However, I explicitly demanded that we implement a strictly phased rollout. I insisted, using hard historical data, that we absolutely had to build mandatory fraud controls into the machine learning algorithm. I demanded that we retain the manual reserve protection protocols to ensure we did not hemorrhage tens of millions of dollars to bad actors during the system migration. I was not fighting innovation. I was fighting his reckless, blinding greed. Weston had surgically cut out all of my valid, necessary financial warnings and kept only my refusal to deploy the unfinished system, weaponizing my own voice to destroy me. I copied the raw, unedited video file, along with the forensic metadata proving the manipulation, onto a highly secure, encrypted flash drive. I sat back in the quiet of my home and held the small piece of metal and plastic in the palm of my hand. I felt the cold, hard weight of absolute victory. Weston Pike had built a beautiful, incredibly lucrative narrative out of shadows, intimidation, forged signatures, and edited film. He truly believed he had successfully pushed me off the board entirely. He was about to find out that I had never actually left the game. I had simply spent the last 7 days quietly, methodically redesigning the entire battlefield to ensure that when he finally made his triumphant winning move, he would step directly onto a landmine. The summons to the executive boardroom on the 42nd floor arrived via a cold, formalized email from the legal department. I walked through the double mahogany doors at exactly 1 p.m. The massive oval table was crowded. The entire board of directors was seated, flanked by the senior executive team. At the far end sat Calvin Rusk, our chief executive officer, looking nervously at his watch. Nora Holloway sat quietly in the corner, a silent observer cloaked in dark wool. I was directed to a solitary chair positioned at the opposite end of the table, isolated from the group. They had structured the room to look like a tribunal. I was the accused, the relevant witness called in for a final, formal reprimand before the Redcrest Capital partners arrived for their 2 o'clock walkthrough. Weston Pike stood at the front of the room, bathing in the glow of a massive presentation screen. He wore a triumphant, shark-like smile. "Thank you all for accommodating this emergency alignment," Weston began, his voice perfectly modulated for the acoustics of the room. "Before we finalize the term sheets with our buyers this afternoon, we must formally close the loop on a recent personnel disruption. As you know, our transition to the automated platform has been hampered by what I call manual drag, specifically, legacy personnel who refuse to adapt." He gestured toward me without breaking eye contact with the board. "Melody Walker represents the absolute resistance to our future. Her recent unauthorized data extraction is a symptom of a localized, toxic culture that we are successfully excising today." Marissa Bell, sitting perfectly upright in her white designer suit, chimed in smoothly. "We are aware that Melody has attempted to build a retaliatory narrative regarding some of our vendor expenditures. Let me be unequivocally clear. The payments routed to Northline Process Lab over the last 3 months were fully authorized. Legitimate beta testing costs for our new software integrations. Melody is simply weaponizing out-of-context financial data out of a personal vendetta because her department was rendered obsolete." They were incredibly polished. They had an answer for everything. Dana Sloan, seated midway down the table, did not raise her hand. She simply stood up. "We are not going to debate printed spreadsheets today." "Marissa," Dana said, her voice cutting through the corporate warmth like a diamond blade. She looked toward the 2 senior engineers standing nervously by the audio-visual controls. "Gentlemen, connect the forensic clone of the master backup server directly to the main display." "Now," Weston's smile faltered, just for a fraction of a second. "Dana, this is highly irregular. The data room is locked down for the buyers." "The board requested my independent audit," Dana snapped back. "Connect the server." The engineers complied. The sleek presentation deck vanished, replaced by the raw, brutalist interface of the company's back-end database. I stood up and kept my voice level. I reached into my pocket, retrieved the encrypted flash drive, and placed it on the table. "Weston claims I am an enemy of innovation," I said, looking directly at the board members. "He intends to prove this to the Redcrest partners using a 2-minute video clip of me allegedly screaming at the executive team, demanding we halt the software rollout. That clip is a fabrication." I nodded to the engineer. He accessed the drive and clicked play on the main screen. The full, unedited, 2-hour recording filled the room. The board watched, in high definition, as I calmly and methodically outlined my total support for the automation rollout. They listened as I explicitly warned Weston that we needed a phased integration, strict fraud controls, and reserve protections to prevent catastrophic financial leakage. They watched Weston dismiss every single financial safeguard I proposed. "I was not fighting the technology," I stated into the dead silence of the room. "I was fighting his refusal to protect your money." Weston's face flushed a deep, mottled red. "This is a desperate distraction. She is trying to deflect from the fact that she leaked proprietary company files." The heavy boardroom doors opened. Eli Mercer walked in. He looked terrified, his face pale and sweating, but he walked straight to the empty space beside me. He did not look at Weston. He looked directly at the chief executive officer. My name is Eli Mercer, he said, his voice shaking so badly it echoed in the large room. I am the new director of automated processing. 3 days ago, I found the original digital drafts of my promotion. The personnel file Marissa Bell submitted to the board says my promotion was authorized on the 12th of October. That is a lie. I did not receive the offer until the 29th of October. They backdated my administrative privileges by 17 days. A low murmur rippled through the board members. Why would they do that? Eli, Dana asked calmly. Because they needed my security credentials. Eli choked out, tears of sheer panic welling in his eyes. My digital signature was dragged onto dozens of high-risk vendor approvals and blind chargeback authorizations that I never even saw. They used my name to rubber stamp fraudulent contracts while the system was artificially flooded. That is an absolute fabrication, Marissa shouted, slamming her hands on the table, her pristine composure entirely shattered. This kid is lying to save himself. I did not give them a single second to breathe. I looked toward the back of the room. The doors opened again. Tessa Rowan stepped inside. Tessa did not walk all the way in. She stood by the threshold, clutching a printed email in her hands. Tessa, I said clearly, what did the media team send to the Redcrest Capitol data room yesterday morning? Tessa swallowed hard, looking at the floor. A highly edited, 3-minute highlight reel of Melody's termination at the town hall. It was categorized under executive leadership proof points. Weston ordered us to upload it as evidence that the company was aggressively cutting legacy costs. The room descended into a suffocating, terrifying quiet. Dana Sloan stepped forward and typed a rapid command into the live server terminal. A master log file populated on the massive screen. It was not a low-level routing metric. It was the highest-level authorization ledger in the company. Calvin, Dana said, turning to the chief executive officer. Please look at the screen. Calvin Rusk leaned forward, squinting at the dense lines of code and authorization timestamps, his brow furrowed in confusion, which rapidly morphed into sheer, unadulterated horror. Those are my administrative tokens, Calvin whispered, his voice entirely devoid of breath. Yes, Dana confirmed. Your digital token was cloned. It was used to blindly authorize the rerouting of all complex dispute cases away from the artificial intelligence pilot and dump them directly onto Melody's team. Your token was also used to manually approve the final wire transfers to Northline Process Lab, a shell company that has absolutely no software integration with our systems. You supposedly signed off on all of this at 3 a.m, on a Sunday, from a virtual private network. Calvin slowly turned his head to look at Weston and Marissa. The color had completely drained from his face. He was not looking at aggressive executives anymore. He was looking at people who had just forged his signature to commit massive corporate fraud. The atmosphere in the boardroom shifted with the violent, cracking force of a tectonic plate. 5 minutes ago, this was a tense political maneuvering session about firing a difficult employee. Now, the air was entirely legal. It was the heavy, suffocating air of federal indictments and prison sentences. Lock down the building, Calvin ordered, his voice suddenly hard and unrecognizable. He pointed a trembling finger at the chief of security standing by the door. Deactivate Weston Pike and Marissa Bell's access badges immediately. Confiscate their company phones. Do not let them touch a single computer. Weston lunged forward, slamming both of his hands onto the mahogany table. Calvin, you are blowing this entirely out of proportion. The buyers are arriving in less than 1 hour. If you do this now, the Redcrest deal dies, and the board loses hundreds of millions of dollars. I built a machine that will save this company. You did not build a machine, Weston, I said, my voice dropping to a low, absolute calm that commanded the entire room. You built a slaughterhouse, and you just locked yourself inside. Marissa Bell sank back into her leather chair, burying her face in her trembling hands. The polished, unassailable facade of the executive team had been entirely vaporized. The hunters had become the prey, and there was absolutely nowhere left for them to run. Dana did not let the suffocating silence in the boardroom hold for more than 5 seconds. She tapped one final, decisive command into her encrypted terminal. A corporate registry document materialized on the massive high-definition display, right next to the master server log showing the forged executive signatures. The financial architecture of your fraud is remarkably unoriginal, Weston, Dana said smoothly, her voice echoing perfectly in the large space. I tracked the massive wire transfers sent to Northline Process Lab. The funds did not go to a software developer. They were routed directly into a private wealth management account tied to a holding company registered in Delaware. The sole managing member of that holding company is your brother-in-law. The money you claimed was for software testing was actually being funneled straight into your own family, before Weston could even open his mouth to formulate a lie. Nora Holloway stepped out of the shadows at the far corner of the room. She walked slowly toward the heavy mahogany table, reaching into her dark wool coat. The entire board of directors watched in absolute, terrified awe as she retrieved a single, meticulously folded piece of thick stationery. She placed it flat on the table, sliding it precisely in front of Calvin Rusk. I also made a phone call early this morning to a very old friend who currently sits on the advisory board of Redcrest Capital, Nora stated, her voice carrying the lethal weight of an executioner. That document is a draft side letter. It is not formally executed, but the digital metadata confirms it was generated by Weston's private legal counsel. It outlines a highly specific, under-the-table agreement. Weston explicitly guaranteed the aggressive termination of what he called legacy personnel in order to unlock a secondary, 8-figure performance bonus for himself and Marissa Bell. That payout was entirely contingent on the acquisition closing by 5 o'clock today. The polished, untouchable chief operating officer finally snapped. The slick corporate mask shattered completely, revealing the desperate, arrogant, and terrified man underneath. "You are all completely blind," Weston screamed, losing his composure for the first time. His face flushed a violent crimson, and his voice cracked loudly as he pointed a shaking finger directly at me. "People like Melody are dragging this entire enterprise straight into the grave. You sit here and protect a dinosaur because you are too terrified to cut the dead weight. You cannot build the future while you are constantly suffocating in the past. I did what had to be done to save our margins." "She is a bottleneck." "It was not fraud," Marissa Bell shrieked, her pristine white designer suit suddenly looking absurd against her pathetic, high-pitched panic. She looked wildly around the table, desperately searching for an ally among the board members. She found only cold, unforgiving stares. "Calvin, listen to me. This is simply a data governance issue. The engineering department mismanaged the artificial intelligence integration. The routing rules were just a technical error. We can fix the reporting structures right now. The chain of evidence is hermetically sealed." "Marissa," Dana replied coldly, closing her laptop. "You cannot blame the engineering team when your own virtual private network address is permanently stamped on the forged ledgers." The senior legal counsel for Brightridge stood up abruptly, adjusting his tie with shaking hands. "This meeting is officially suspended," he declared. He turned his head and looked directly at the security personnel stationed heavily by the boardroom doors. "Escort Mr. Pike and Miss Bell to the basement level. Do not allow them to return to their offices. Confiscate all physical access keys, company-issued electronics, and network tokens immediately." The security guards moved forward. There was no screaming from the guards, no dramatic physical struggle. The absolute, heavy silence of the two large men placing their hands firmly on Weston and Marissa's shoulders was far more devastating than any shouting match. The corporate game was over. They were marched out of the boardroom, their incredibly lucrative futures replaced instantly by the terrifying, looming reality of federal prison. Within 20 minutes, Calvin Rusk placed a frantic call to the senior partners at Redcrest Capital, who were waiting in a luxury hotel across town. The moment they heard the words forensic audit and forged executive tokens, the acquisition was officially terminated. Redcrest severed all ties and canceled the deal before the hour was up. Calvin slowly turned his heavy leather chair to face me. The exact same leadership team that had watched me get publicly slaughtered on a massive screen just days ago now sat with their heads bowed in profound, agonizing shame. "Melody," Calvin said, his voice completely hollow and broken. "I was blind. I allowed them to humiliate you. I allowed them to dismantle everything you spent over a decade building. I am deeply, profoundly sorry." Nora Holloway walked over and rested her hand gently on the back of Calvin's chair. "The board of directors is formally rescinding your termination. Melody, we want you to return to your position as Director of Returns Processing immediately. We will make you whole." I looked at the powerful people sitting around the table. My pulse was steady. I had won the war, but I was not interested in returning to the status quo. "I am not taking my old chair back," I said, my voice steady and completely devoid of sentiment, "because the company I worked for no longer exists. If I return to this building, I return under my own terms." Calvin nodded quickly, desperate to stop the bleeding. "Name them." "First, we are creating a brand new division," I instructed, laying my hands flat on the table. "Operational integrity, I will run it as an executive vice president, and my department will report directly to the board of directors, completely bypassing the standard executive suite. Second, every single workflow automation cut is frozen immediately. Nobody loses their job until my team conducts a granular, case-by-case review of the artificial intelligence framework. And third, Eli Mercer keeps his job, but he reports directly to me." The board agreed unanimously before I even finished standing up. 1 week later, I stood in the exact same auditorium where my public execution had been staged. The room was packed with over 100 colleagues. The air conditioning still hummed with that familiar sterile scent, but the atmosphere was entirely different. There was no toxic silence, no averted eyes, no hidden smirks. The massive screen behind me did not display my name in a glaring red box of shame. It displayed the newly restructured organizational chart of Brightridge, with my name sitting firmly at the top of the Integrity Division. I walked slowly to the center of the stage. I looked down into the front row. Eli Mercer was sitting there, his posture straight, looking at me with profound gratitude. I did not raise my voice. I did not use the moment to exact petty revenge or demand groveling apologies from the people who had abandoned me. I looked out into the massive crowd, scanning the faces of the people I had fought so ruthlessly to protect. "We are entering a new era," I said, leaning slightly toward the microphone. "But we will not build it by sacrificing the people who laid our foundation." I paused, letting my eyes sweep the room one last time before delivering the final truth. The thing that bottlenecks a company is not experience. It is greed masquerading as innovation. The entire room fell dead silent, absorbing the absolute, undeniable weight of my words. Thank you so much for listening to my story today. Please leave a comment down below and let me know where in the world you are listening from so we can connect and share our thoughts together. If you enjoyed this, do not forget to subscribe to the Boss Revenge Stories channel, like this video, and support me even more by hitting the hype button so that the story in this video can be heard by many